And first, I just want to say it's great to have such a broad and diverse interest group or uh, items that you guys are interested in, because I think offshore wind can potentially impact all of that. And so before I dive into the presentation, I'm just going to go over the order of things I'll talk about. So first, we'll talk about the current conditions of offshore wind or the current developments that are ongoing. And then we'll talk about how offshore wind would impact each of the designations, such as the national seashore, the national marine sanctuaries, the marine protected areas off the coast of Marin. So starting off with an overview of offshore wind is this map presents the wind speeds that are ideal for offshore wind development. And you can see that the darker the color, the more ideal it is for offshore wind. So the more northern you go in California, the more ideal it is. And you have this area right by the seashore where it is relatively ideal compared to the rest of the state. So the potential for offshore wind in off the coast of Marin County is a possibility. Um, and talking about current developments, we have two leasing projects that are currently active and being sold off to companies to develop offshore wind. The first is in the Humboldt area off the coast of Eureka, and the second is in Central California off the coast of Morro Bay. The one relevant to EAC will be the one off of the Humboldt area because you need to get the energy that's being produced at these sites to the urban areas. And the urban areas are Southern California, the Bay Area, and the Central Valley. So there are proposals to essentially transmit the power through transmission lines um, from the Humboldt leasing area, which is the area in yellow off the coast, um, to the urban areas. And according to the National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium, they have some proposals about where those transmission lines are going to go. So this map reflects the current infrastructure for transmission lines in California. And the color of the lines are demonstrate the wattage that each of those transmission lines can carry. And you can see that there's a gap between the Humboldt leasing area and the network and the existing network. So the research consortium has proposed the following. And in the dashed purple and black lines, you have proposed transmission lines from the Humboldt leasing area to the Bay Area. There are substations where the power is received in Marin County, and these proposed transmission lines have the potential to go through ecologically sensitive areas and areas that have already been designated for fisheries, for conservation, and for the national park or the national seashore. And this provides a bit more of a clearer picture. These transmission lines are not exact routes, but they demonstrate the extent to which many lines will need to be constructed from the Humboldt area to the Bay Area, specifically Marin County, in order to reach those substations. So now this map presents the Humboldt area, and you can go down south and see Point Reyes sticking out right above the Bay Area. And so let's just take a look at what kind of conservation areas or designations already exist offshore that could potentially get in the way of these transmission lines. So first you have habitats of particular concern, essential fish habitat conservation areas, and of course, the national marine sanctuaries. But that's not all. You also have marine protected areas by the state. And this includes the federal seaward, the state marine conservation area, and the state marine reserves. But that's not all. We can add another layer to non-designations that include habitat areas. So you have whales, birds, turtles, who all travel and migrate offshore. Um, and the transmission lines will impact these habitats. And so when thinking about the transmission lines, we need to not only think about the current designations, but also the habitat areas that fall outside of current designations. So starting off, now it's going to get a little dense here, but don't worry, there's no exam at the end. But starting off with the coastal zone, we have a coastal zone in Marin County where certain developments require permits in order to be approved, and that is colored in pink on the map. And now, all this text is not relevant. The relevant text is the following, and that is that there is an allowable um, permitting process for energy projects in the coastal zone. And so in the coastal zone, the secretary of the CDFW is able to allow energy projects such as power generation or transmission lines, um, so long as they consider protection for the environment, conservation of natural resources, and impact on fisheries. And so as long as they meet those criteria of considering and implementing mitigating um, actions for each of those areas, transmission lines would be permitted. Next is the actual seashore. So with the seashore, you have an interesting provision. The overall goal of the national parks is to provide for unimpaired enjoyment of resources for future generations. And the authorization of certain activities shall not be permitted unless Congress has acted. However, Congress has acted specifically regarding transmission lines in lands managed by the National Park Service. And specifically, they allow for right-of-ways to be granted for transmission lines through lands managed by the National Park System. This essentially allows um, transmission lines to be built, oops, to be built and constructed through the Point Reyes National Seashore. And what's interesting is that this exemption or this allowance for transmission lines was permitted after a dispute with a national seashore on the East Coast, where there was an offshore wind project in North Carolina that was going to impact a national seashore out there. And essentially, Congress intervened and essentially allowed the offshore wind project to occur in the lands and waters impacting the national seashore over there. So the idea that we saw the wind speed map at the beginning of the presentation, but the idea that you can construct offshore wind with just considering the national seashore is a possibility. Um, However, one thing that's present in Point Reyes National Seashore that was not present at that other seashore on the East Coast is the wilderness area. And so we have the Philip Burton Wilderness Area, and it contains one of the only the marine wilderness area on the West Coast. And this makes this unique. So while the power generation and transmission lines would be allowed through the National Park Service lands, wilderness areas are governed by a different set of laws and a different act entirely. Um, and essentially, this would prohibit the construction or allowance of a right of way through the wilderness area. So while it may be allowed through the national park areas, the areas governed by the Wilderness Act, the Philip Burton Wilderness Area, um, prohibit the transmission lines from um, being built here. Now, there is an exemption for transmission lines, but that is only for lands managed by the National Forest Service, not the National Park Service. And of course, in the future, the Congress can change that. But for now, the wilderness area prohibits the right-of-ways of transmission lines um, through certain portions of the national seashore. So moving from the seashore to the marine protected areas. Now, marine protected areas generally prohibit taking depending on how that marine protected area is classified. So within state marine conservation areas, certain take is allowed, and that take would continue to be allowed um, um, as long as mitigation is allowed in those conservation areas. However, state marine reserves present a different level of protection that state conservation areas do not provide. Any take or any kind of harm to marine species in state marine reserves is prohibited. And this also applies to projects that would be proposed, such as transmission lines, through these areas. And just to give you some context, this map shows the MPAs off of the coast of Marin. And in blue are the state marine conservation areas, and in red are the state marine reserves. And so the state marine reserves have a higher level of protection than the state marine conservation areas. And we actually have a case study that we can use or a precedent with the Vandenberg State Marine Reserve off the coast of Lompoc, where you do have an offshore wind project active there right now. However, if you see the orange dotted line, that represents the transmission line that they built to take the energy that the project is producing and bring it onshore. And they specifically go around the State Marine Reserve rather than go through it. And so this provides strong precedence for the idea that, or reinforcement for the idea that state marine reserves deserve a higher level of protection than the state marine conservation areas, and that transmission lines and the construction of transmission lines would not be consistent with the uses of a state marine reserve. And you can see that they could have created a much shorter route to the substation off of in Surf Beach, but they decided to go around, which because of this state marine reserve. Now, finally, we have the national marine sanctuaries. So we have two of them off the coast of Marin. We have the Greater Farallones and Cordell Bank. Now, for these designations, it's ultimately up to the discretion of the director of the National Marine Sanctuaries Office to issue special use permits for the allowance of transmission lines. So essentially, this is a discretionary project, and even though certain activities are generally prohibited, under these special use permit, the transmission lines would fall outside those prohibitions. And so while there is extreme reverence for the national marine sanctuaries, and they would not be, and transmission lines would not be permitted generally, special use permits allow these transmission lines to be constructed in the area. And however, what's interesting is you have a proposed national marine sanctuary in Southern California called the Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary. And we were talking about the two leasing areas earlier. One is in Humboldt and one is in the Morro Bay area. And in light blue, it's hard to differentiate from the water, but in the light blue, you have the wind energy area. And in red, you have the proposed Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary. Now, when NOAA, the National Atmospheric and Oceanic Administration, was considering um, how this project would impact this proposed sanctuary, they considered the subsea cables. And when they were considering the subsea cables, they decided to change the boundaries of the proposed national marine sanctuaries. Now, I'm not saying that the Cordell Bank or Greater Farallone's boundaries are going to change because this national marine sanctuary has not been proposed yet. And so, in proposing the national marine sanctuary, the boundaries are more easily changed. However, the idea that the use or construction of subsea cables is not consistent or would not be allowed in national marine sanctuaries is reinforced by this idea that they're creating a corridor where the national marine sanctuary does not exist in order to allow for these subsea cables from the offshore wind site. And so this can be promising for Greater Farallones and Cordell Bank by demonstrating how these transmission lines would not be permissible within the National Marine Sanctuary. However, as was discussed before, they would be allowed under special use permit. So, what are the takeaways from this presentation? I know I was talking a lot. So I think that there can be some guiding principles that EAC can take when developing a policy on offshore wind, because offshore wind is something that frankly is inevitable because there is such a high demand for clean energy in California and increasing energy demands. And so there is an immense amount of investment, a lot of time, and a lot of effort being expended in order to create these offshore leasing sites and develop these offshore leasing sites. So these transmission lines um, are likely to come. So when EAC thinks about these offshore transmission lines, we need to think about how that they would impact existing designations. So today that we talked about the coastal zone, the national seashore, the wilderness area, the marine protected areas, and the national marine sanctuaries. Through each of these designations, they each have different requirements pertaining to the construction and operation of offshore wind transmission lines. And so thinking about how EAC can get involved in each of these designations, we can use the Wilderness Act, which provides the strongest basis for considering impacts to these areas. We can get involved in the discretionary permitting process at the Coastal Commission, the National Park Service, CDFW, NOAA, and the Bureau of Oceanic Energy Administration. And we have precedent that shows us how these designations have been treated previously with the Vandenberg State Marine Reserve and the Chumash National Marine Sanctuary. And so with that, these provide EAC with options on how to approach potential projects in the future. And that is the end of the presentation. Any questions?
Wow. Well, I just want to jump in and say thank you so much, Chris, for developing this presentation and really for all your commitment to EAC. Chris has been with us for, I guess, almost a year now, and it's been such a pleasure working with him. I did want to add that EAC has supported the Chumash Sanctuary designation, which is tribally led, sort of as a related point that we're looking forward to that moving forward. And the one other thing, I think we did have 2 more people join, Grace and Adrian. So I might just let them do a super quick intro, and then yes, I'll turn it back to you, Chris, to take questions and comments on this great presentation. But Grace and Adrian, if you just want to say a quick hello.
Hi, everyone. Sorry for joining late. My name is Grace Milstein, and I'm EAC's Communication Associate, and I caught the end of Chris's presentation, so I'll have to watch the beginning of it in the recording because it sounds really fascinating.
Thanks,
Hi,
Grace.
I'm Adrian. I'm a legal policy intern with the EAC, and yeah, like this presentation looks really good. I know I missed a lot of it, but love the main takeaway and the major things that you're touching on there.
Well, luckily we're recording it. And then thank you both for introducing yourselves. And let's see, we're already getting some questions, Chris. So Nils asked, what is the timeline of these types of projects?
Yes, that is an excellent question, Niels. So the timeline for these projects varies depending on what agencies are getting involved and when. So with the Coastal Commission, you have the Coastal Commission currently streamlining the process for specifically for transmission lines. And so they're looking to shorten the process for approval. We don't know what the timeline will be for agencies like the National Park Service and CDFW, simply because they haven't had to encounter them before. But BOEM, the Bureau of Oceanic Energy Administration, is seeking to streamline these projects and specifically streamline projects that are for the maintenance and operation of offshore wind turbines. And so with the current regime, it can take a decade for the leasing and the permitting to be completed. And the leasing will take much longer than the actual permitting. But that process is currently being shortened as we speak. So I hope that answers your question.
I can maybe add one thing just related to, I think that the Morro Bay and the Humboldt ones, I mean, those are definitely already in process, but in terms of like how it impacts our coast and the streamlining, it sounds like, well, Chris, your answer was great. And it sounds like we kind of have to watch because it's not happening quite yet. But yeah, I know the Coastal Commission has kind of been increasing their staffing and, you know, this is something they haven't had to deal with so much in the past. So it's definitely a big undertaking. And Nil says thanks. And then I think we had a couple raised hands, although now I don't see them. I think it was Leslie, maybe someone else, or maybe just pipe up if you have another question.
Yeah, I think I saw Leslie, Richard, and Sarah. So I guess we'll start with Leslie.
Sorry, I
Oh, it's okay.
kind of took my hand down because I was thinking like just going backwards, and it's probably irrelevant now, but just wondering why they can't bring the transmission lines across and then down land. Is that just is that just more complicated, I guess, with different property owners and things like that, but there are other right of ways. So I was just curious about that.
Yeah, you're touching on a very important point because none of this would be considered if they just brought the transmission lines over land. But the benefits of bringing the transmission lines through the ocean rather than over land, or outweigh the consequences of bringing it over land. First, maintenance would be a lot easier because with land, you would have to deal with different terrain, property ownership, wildfire, earthquake hazards, all sorts of things that you don't need to worry about when you're bringing it through the ocean. Also with the ocean, it's much easier to just simply set it up. You're laying these big cables. They're essentially the size of tunnels, or small tunnels like pipes. And it's just much easier similar to the internet, and how the internet is transmitted through undersea cables. It's much easier to lay cables on the seafloor than it is to build and maintain the infrastructure on land. And you also have a mountain range here in Northern California, which will make things even more complicated. So I hope that answers your question, but yeah, it's just the costs of undersea cables are less than over land.
I have a piece of this question too, and I'm thinking, you know, the Great Redwood Trail as an example, where there's already a throughway to Humboldt, for example, and they're working on that right now. Have we actually looked at those possibilities for something like that? I mean, because you're going to have to move, you know, on land. at some point. So there's going to be a cost anyhow. And what's the thinking around that?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the thinking would be from the perspective of those who are constructing the transmission lines. But for some of these concerns with these designations, we would want um, the the transmission lines to come onshore prior to reaching areas such as the Farallones National Marine Sanctuary, or we want them to get onshore before they impact the marine protected areas or the national seashore. So bringing those onshore before they reach those areas um, would play a big role in reducing the impact to the seafloor and habitat on the seafloor um, that they otherwise would have. So I hope, does that answer your question, Maury?
Yeah, it partially it does. Thank you. And this is a great presentation. I hope you
Thanks.
share it with widely.
Thank you. And I'll go to Sarah Allen.
Hi, thanks. You did a really great presentation. I applaud it. It's very, very concisely put forward. I just had a couple of comments and no questions. One, I just want to say in the streamlining, I've been involved when I worked for the Park Service with this more than 10 years ago with the agencies of Washington, Oregon, California with BOEM because BOEM was doing the initial outreach and with the tribes. So this is not streamlined. and I would expect what they've got here is probably the best they've been able to do at this point, recognizing that it may be another 10 years, if anything, gets floated. So, and administrations do make a difference. So that's just my perspective on it. And the other is I was glad you brought up about the wilderness in Point Reyes National Seashore, and that's because no development is allowed in a wilderness, congressionally designated wilderness. However, Golden Gate National Recreation Area does not have wilderness as a national park, and so accommodations could be made for there, just as an aside. And that's all. But again, I really think you did a great job in presenting it. Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, I really appreciate the insight that you have, Sarah. So thank you. And Richard?
Thank you, Chris. First off, I'd just like to say great presentation. Absolutely great. And I really do appreciate the opportunity to be able to see again basically what is going on. That is a excellent point. I forget who it was that just mentioned it just a minute ago regarding going from the areas at which they are developing the offshore wind from the to land directly. And I do see as a fisherman and understanding, having been in electrical transmission and distribution and being on the ROTA board and the ROSA board and all these different offshore wind committees and everything, I do understand the different issues that are occurring. And grid tie is a very definite problem in that there isn't the capacity in most of the transmission lines to be able to add additional electrical current to those particular units at any particular time. So I think that's primarily why they've decided to go in the water. Am I correct on that?
Yes. And so the capacity for the lines, you can see this graph or map is the current transmission line infrastructure. And you can see that there is a very, very faint gray line going from Eureka to the more established transmission network. And you can see that the voltage is much lower. And so the idea of upgrading those lines for the capacity that the offshore wind turbines will generate would be too costly. And so it would just be
Mhm.
easier to lay cables. But yes, you're exactly right.
Okay. Well, then couple other little minor items, I guess. You know, and one of the things that is very concerning to me is adaptive management in this particular situation. And to give you a quick example, the Bodega Bay area originally, I had originally been put. I'm self-sufficient here at my home, solar and everything else, So I had originally been going to put a wind generator here. The average wind at that particular time was roughly 12 to 15 knots. That was average, and that's the minimal level that you can have in order to make these things actually function. The biggest concern I have is going through all of this effort, on all of this stuff, trying to get all these permits and everything, and then have this climate change to the point where now all of a sudden things change. They go to a different area, the wind conditions change significantly. And it's a concern that adaptive management hasn't been built into the process. So I want to be sure that when we look at this in the long term, that we are evaluating all the possibilities and all the impacts, which I know we are, but it's difficult. So I'm sorry to make a long statement, but that's a very big concern of mine. Thank
No,
you.
yeah. Yeah, and that's a very good point. It's similar to building a water reservoir or building a new dam, but then the water levels of the river change. And so we can think about the same way with wind, potentially with climate change. Um, so I think that's adaptive management is going to be important here.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you for all these great questions. Actually, I guess last call for questions. Are there any other questions or comments?
I have a quick question. How are the cost benefits and environmental costs calculated when they're looking at their projects?
That is an excellent question. And that's why it would be important for groups like EAC to weigh in, because it really depends on the administration with these discretionary processes. So, like Sarah Allen mentioned, depending on what administration is in charge for at the federal level or even the state level, for the National Marine Sanctuaries, for the National Park Service, for these state marine protected areas, what they consider will change because the permitting process is discretionary. And so there are some required impacts they have to consider, but the extent to they consider them uh, will change. So, for example, for the Coastal Commission, the Coastal Zone Management Act requires that the secretary, when approving these permits, include protection for the environment. But protection for the environment will change depending on who's doing the reviewing for these discretionary permits. Same thing for Section J, where they need consideration of any other use of the sea or seabed, including use of a fishery. Um, Considering the use of the fishery will change depending on who's doing the review at the time. So it largely depends on the administration. I hope that helps, but yeah.
Scares me, but thank you.
Yeah.